For more than 3 decades, the name Barry Sanders has remained the absolute gold standard of greatness in American football, a rare genius whose every run became a legend. No one was like him, a small, quiet running back who almost never said much, but every time he touched the ball, the entire stadium seemed to hold its breath. 10 consecutive seasons over 1,000 yards, a feat no one in NFL history has ever repeated. The 1997 season over 2,000 yards, Hall of Fame on the first ballot, Heisman Trophy in college, NFL MVP at the peak of his career, accolades that other athletes spend a lifetime dreaming of, Barry Sanders achieved in just 1 decade of playing. And amid all that glory, he maintained an almost unreal humility. No celebrations after touchdowns, no showboating, no need for the camera's praise. He simply ran, handed the ball to the official, and walked back as if the glory had never belonged to him. His greatness wasn't just in the statistics, but in the way he forced America to look up to the most humble legend the NFL has ever produced. Yet behind that seemingly invincible man was a heart that carried more wounds than anyone could imagine. A childhood in Wichita filled with arguing voices, a father so stern he almost never offered praise, years of being dismissed because of his small frame, all of it carved deep scars into Barry's soul that he never put into words. He didn't run just to score points. He ran to escape the darkness of his childhood, the feeling of not being good enough, the loneliness that even success couldn't fill. That took him from an invisible boy to an icon of an entire city, but that same pressure also quietly suffocated him in ways no one noticed. The man who once evaded hundreds of tackles and thousands of hits on the field nearly lost his life in the silence of a morning in 2024 when his heart betrayed him. And in that fragile moment, all of America had to face a painful question: how could a legend who overcame every pressure of the NFL almost be brought down by the very heart he poured into every step of his life? If you want to continue following the tragic yet brilliantly shining journey of the legend Barry Sanders, please hit subscribe so you don't miss any future parts. And if this story touched you even a little, don't forget to leave a like. It's a way to help honor those who rose through darkness to reach greatness. Wichita in the 1960s was a place where hope often died before it could even take shape. A small city in the middle of America, overlooked by prosperity, where streets were coated in the thick dust of poverty, where black neighborhoods existed only on the edges of the map, and the future was always obscured by the invisible wall of racism and class prejudice. In the cramped house deep in that working-class area, Barry Sanders grew up as one of the many shadows blending into a noisy crowd of children, a face that even neighbors sometimes couldn't remember. His family was large, meals were always scarce, arguments about money and survival became such a familiar sound that no one paid attention anymore. In that place, children didn't have childhoods, they had responsibilities. They didn't ask "what's your dream?" but rather "will we have enough money for tomorrow's bills?" Barry, a quiet boy, learned one thing: don't bother anyone. His father, William, was the old-school type, living by discipline, saying little and doing much, believing love was something you didn't openly show. To William, sternness was love, and silence was how he kept the family standing. But for a boy who needed a nod of approval, a word of praise, a hug, that kind of love became a cold wall, teaching Barry early on to shrink himself so he wouldn't be a burden. He never once heard his father say, "I'm proud of you," even later when he became the best athlete in the city. All he got were stern looks, half-hearted nods, and sometimes an unintentional dismissal that cut deeply into his young heart. In that always noisy house, Barry felt alone, as if he were the extra child, a boy so good that no one noticed him. After dinner, when everyone else dove into unfinished conversations, little Barry would quietly slip out to the porch, stepping carefully over the creaky wooden floor to avoid making noise. No one asked where he was going, and maybe they didn't even know he had left. He ran, not to train for a future career, but to escape the suffocation of the house, the feeling of being forgotten, his father's cold silence, his siblings' arguments, the sense of being left behind. The red dirt roads around the working-class neighborhood of Wichita became his only refuge. Under the dim yellow streetlights, The small boy's shadow stretched long across the ground, then collapsed with each stride. Barry ran fast, but not to beat anyone. He ran as if every step was saving himself from a darkness only he could see. Night wind rushed past his ears, footsteps pounded, sweat mixed with tears that sometimes fell but no one ever knew. In those evenings, Barry learned to swallow every sadness. He learned to handle pain with silence, to endure rather than fight back, to bury the hurt deep inside, instead of asking why he wasn't loved like other children. And it was in Wichita, on those lonely runs beneath the vast sky, that Barry forged the will that America would later call inhuman. No one saw the runs in the dark that built a spirit tougher than steel. No one saw the small child using his own loneliness to forge strength. No one saw a future legend being shaped by being forgotten. His family was so poor that every sports shirt was worn for years. Every pair of shoes had worn out soles long before they were replaced. But material poverty wasn't what hurt Barry most. The real pain was the feeling of being unimportant, the sense that his presence or absence changed nothing. And to survive in such an environment, Barry became an expert at making himself invisible. He didn't talk much to avoid being a bother. He didn't ask for anything to avoid troubling others. He didn't cry because he knew no one would comfort him. The only thing he could control was his feet. In a world where everything felt unfair, running was the one thing he owned. And that was the beginning of the journey that would take him from a forgotten boy to the man who would make millions around the world leap to their feet every time he touched the ball. But back then, in the poor Wichita of the 1960s, no one knew that the small child running alone out there would become one of the greatest icons in American sports. And Barry, in that silence, knew only one thing: he would have to save himself because no one else would do it for him. When Barry entered high school, the world didn't become easier. It just changed shape, from the chaos of family to the coldness of judging eyes. If at home he was the extra one, at school he became invisible in a different way. A player no one believed in, a body too small to survive in football, as many coaches bluntly told him to his face. On the practice field, Barry stood among bigger, heavier, more aggressive boys. Coaches would glance at him and shake their heads. Friends smirked. That little guy's playing football. None of them saw anything but his short stature, skinny arms, and the silence that made Barry seem like a blank sheet of paper in a room full of writing. At an age when a single word of encouragement could change a life, Barry received only doubt and ridicule. Coaches kept him on the bench. Each game passed with him getting just a few seconds at the end, when the outcome was already decided and no one cared anymore. No one asked how he felt. No one asked what he wanted. No one thought that small boy carried a pain greater than any hit on the field. But Barry still showed up every day. He stood behind the long line of players, waiting for his turn even though he knew it would never come. Whenever his name wasn't called, he just lowered his head slightly, as if he had grown used to being left off the list. And it was in those moments that an invisible pain began to take shape, something that would haunt him for life. Barry wasn't just underrated, he was treated as if he didn't exist. The only thing keeping him from collapsing was the image of his mother, Shirley, the one person who ever looked at Barry without judgment, but she was too busy surviving to follow him every day. She worked multiple jobs, came home exhausted, without enough energy to ask her son if he was happy or sad, if he had won or lost, if he had gotten on the field at all. Still, in the rare moments when mother and son could sit together, she always said one thing: "Barry, you're much better than you think." That short, simple sentence was the only thread holding Barry back from the edge of despair. But it still wasn't enough to make him feel he belonged anywhere. School wasn't a place for kids like Barry. The football field wasn't either. Even on the team, he remained the one standing on the sideline, watching the game happen without anyone asking his opinion. To keep from going crazy with that loneliness, Barry went to the only place where he still felt some control, the empty field after school. As the sun sank behind the Wichita rooftops, Barry quietly returned to the field. No lights, no crowd, no teammates, just darkness and the sound of one boy's footsteps, trying to prove to himself that he was worthy. He set the ball down, stepped back a few paces and ran. Every burst of speed was a scream he never let out. Every cut was a dodge away from the contemptuous looks of the day. Every drop of sweat was a tear he wasn't allowed to shed. Barry ran until he couldn't breathe, until his knees went numb, until his legs could no longer lift his small body. Then he lay down on the cold grass, staring up at the pitch-black sky that mirrored the future everyone predicted for him. No one knew these nights existed. No coach ever saw those steps buried in darkness. No one on the team knew that the least noticed boy spent hours honing skills that would one day terrify the entire NFL. For other kids, football was a game. For Barry, it was the only escape from a world that had no place for him. Gradually, the dark field became home. The night wind became a friend. Silence became an ally. And in that very loneliness, a genius began to take shape, not because anyone believed in him, but because he had no other choice but to believe in himself. Those solo evening practices could never be captured in stats or record books. No numbers recorded the hurt that created the drive. No report measured the sadness that made him run faster, sharper. But those hours were what forged the legs that would later make the biggest NFL linebackers fall with just one cut. No one knew that the unreasonable quickness the NFL praised was actually born from being overlooked. No one knew that his genius change of direction was actually forged from dodging emotional wounds. No one knew that Barry Sanders' terrifying calm on the field was actually a shell hiding a childhood he was never allowed to speak about. In high school, Barry Sanders didn't shine. No one called his name. No one saw anything special in those small legs. But those legs in the darkness of empty fields were quietly creating something miraculous, something that would shatter every stereotype, crush every mocking word, and turn the boy too small to succeed into one of the greatest icons in American sports history. But back then no one knew. No one saw, except for one boy standing in the darkness, breathing heavily, hands clutching the ball like he was holding the only hope of his life, and he kept running. But then life, which had always been cruel to Barry, unexpectedly opened a small crack of light when he stepped foot into Oklahoma State. It wasn't a dream laid out on a silver platter, not a glamorous invitation, but just a fragile opportunity, a backup spot, much like the forgotten years on the high school bench. Barry arrived in Stillwater not as a sought-after talent, but as a small name buried at the bottom of the roster, behind the big stars, expected only to stay quiet, do his job, and not cause any trouble. And true to the stereotypes that had followed him since childhood, Barry began his first season at Oklahoma State in the position he knew all too well, standing behind others, being someone else's shadow, waiting for opportunities that seemed like they would never come. The man ahead of Barry was Thurman Thomas, an outstanding running back with a bright NFL future, the one the whole team believed would bring glory to the school. Barry didn't envy him. He just quietly practiced, quietly observed, quietly shrank into the small shadow he had learned to exist in throughout his childhood. But there are moments in life when despair becomes the springboard of fate. One autumn afternoon in a heavy collision, Thomas injured his knee. The whole school was shaken, and amid the whispers, the team's anxiety, the fear that the season would fall apart, a simple sentence emerged. "Let's give Barry a try." That simple statement shook the entire trajectory of his life. When Barry stepped onto the field for the first time, the grass beneath his feet seemed to tremble, as if afraid of a future he himself wasn't sure he was strong enough to carry. People expected little, or almost nothing, from him. But after just the first few runs, a few cuts that sent opposing defenders tumbling like they'd been swept into a small but powerful whirlwind, the atmosphere on the field shifted from doubt to stunned silence. Something extraordinary had just appeared. Something inexplicable, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Then came the 1988 season, the season that took Barry Sanders from darkness to the brightest spotlight college football had ever seen. He didn't just play well, he demolished every defense, shattered records, turned every game into a ruthless work of art. 2,600 yards in a single season, an unimaginable number, 37 touchdowns, a scoring storm that collapsed every statistic, a total of 34 NCAA records broken, a legendary season so perfect that experts called it the greatest season in college football history. Stillwater was intoxicated by that miracle. All of America began mentioning Barry Sanders' name with a respect he had never known before. Fans lined up for autographs. The media praised him as a born genius. ESPN analysts called him a natural wonder of football. The whole world looked at that small man and saw a king just crowned on the turf. But Barry, the child forgotten in Wichita, the teenager who sat on the bench through high school, didn't know what to do with that sudden light. When the cheers thundered from the stands, he just bowed his head. When cameras sought his face, he turned away. When strangers hugged him like a hero, he just stood there, awkward, as if unsure he had the right to accept that affection. And deep inside, a familiar voice, the voice that had haunted him throughout childhood, whispered again, "You don't deserve this." Every night after setting another record, Barry sat alone in his dorm room, the desk lamp shining on his weary face. On one side was the glory America was celebrating. On the other was the fear that everything he had was only temporary, that one day someone would realize he was just the small boy from Wichita, not strong enough, not good enough, not worthy enough. Joy mixed with pain, glory mixed with fear. The world saw extraordinary strength, but Barry only saw the forgotten child, unable to believe the spotlight was truly on him. Even in the moment he accepted the Heisman Trophy, the most prestigious award a college player can receive, Barry kept a humble expression that bordered on sadness. He didn't cry, didn't raise his arms, didn't shout in joy. He just bowed his head, clenching his fingernails until they turned white to hold back the chaotic emotions from spilling over. Because for Barry, the childhood pain had never healed. And now, with success flooding in like a torrent, it didn't just lift him up, it also dragged along all the deep insecurities he had buried for so long. To the world, it was the greatest season in history. To Barry it was a season so beautiful, it took his breath away, but full of darkness. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't failure, it's the first realization that you might actually succeed. And when a light too bright shines on someone who has never dared to look directly at themselves, it doesn't just illuminate, it also exposes all the cracks he had tried to hide his whole life. The explosion at Oklahoma State took Barry to the 1989 NFL Draft, a door most players could only gaze at from afar. But when that door opened, it led him to a path no one, not even he, could have foreseen. The Detroit Lions, the weakest team in the league, where hope often died before the season even started. A franchise rich in history, but all sad history. Years of losses piled up, locker rooms lacking confidence, quiet stands because fans were too used to disappointment. And now, into that land of despair, stepped a 21-year-old carrying the light from the most perfect college season in history. Detroit rejoiced. The media whispered hope, but Barry himself sank into silence, as if sensing he was about to enter a place not meant for dreams, but for grinding down. Unlike powerhouse teams like the 49ers or Packers, Detroit had no system, no strategy, no foundation to elevate a talent to the top. Barry arrived like a diamond tossed onto rocky ground. Every game, he had to create his own opportunities, escape tackles himself, find a way to survive in an offensive system that offered him no help. If Oklahoma State was where Barry proved he belonged, Detroit became the place where he had to fight not to be swallowed whole. But the most paradoxical, cruelest thing was that in that crumbling organization, Barry blossomed into a legend. Detroit no longer saw failure, they saw a small miracle zigzagging through giants. One burst of speed made the whole stadium erupt. One cut sent the entire city rising from their seats. The Detroit Lions didn't just have a player, they had a savior, an angel in jersey number 20. But that very thing weighed heavier on Barry's heart. Even though he surpassed 1,000 yards every season, even though he was the face of the team, even though the entire NFL called him the genius runner, deep down Barry felt trapped. Not trapped in his career, but trapped in the responsibility of carrying an entire city on his legs. Every game was the same, the team stalled, everyone turned to Barry. When leading, Barry had to maintain it. When trailing, Barry had to salvage it. When the team needed hope, that hope rested on his shoulders. Year after year, Barry's superhuman efforts only got the Lions to average, sometimes painful losses, sometimes early playoff exits. He looked around the locker room at tired faces, exhausted teammates, coaches trying but unable to break decades of stagnation. Even when forcing a smile, Barry carried a growing disappointment. One night, after a heavy loss, he sat silently in the darkened locker room, only faint light slipping through the door crack, and for the first time he dared admit what he had avoided for years. I'm wasting my youth, not because Detroit was bad, but because Detroit had no big dreams. And Barry, despite his silence, his humility, his avoidance of showmanship, was still the man with the biggest dreams, winning for the whole team, not just himself. But Detroit could never catch up to those dreams. Seasons passed like crumpled pages. The greater Barry became, the weaker the Lions grew. And that contradiction turned the NFL into a beautiful prison, where stadium lights shone like gold. But inside, Barry felt like a prisoner trapped in admiration, unable to escape, unable to change, unable to voice his pain. Outside the field, fans called him a miracle. Inside him, that miracle was slowly becoming a curse. Every run carried the question, could he alone save a group that didn't want to save itself? Was his talent being buried under missed seasons? Detroit loved Barry, and Barry loved Detroit, but it was a love tinged with bitterness, like someone spending their youth waiting for something they knew would never come. And through each year, each run, each cut, Barry felt himself being worn down, not by opponents, but by hopelessness itself. In long hotel nights, when the team slept, Barry often stood at the window, city lights reflecting on his sad face. He wondered what he had lost on the road to glory. He wondered how much longer he could go on. The NFL, once Barry's dream, had become a brightly lit prison, where he ran not to win, but to avoid sinking into the oblivion of a team that could never find the light. And in that silence, a small crack formed in Barry's heart, a crack that years later would become the reason America was stunned when he suddenly walked away from the NFL at the peak of his career. But even as Barry Sanders became the only ray of light for the Detroit Lions, even as his name was mentioned as one of the greatest running backs in history, a cruel truth still crept into his heart. All the glory others saw was just a mask hiding the emptiness he felt every day. Barry kept breaking records, kept doing things others called superhuman, but he himself felt nothing but a void that grew wider inside him. Every time he ran through a defense, every time he made tens of thousands of fans scream, every time he created moments commentators called unbelievable, Barry still wore that expressionless face, not because he was cold, but because real joy had never reached the heart that had been closed since childhood. When he scored a touchdown, the entire stadium turned into a storm of sound, but Barry just gently handed the ball to the official and walked back into the open space behind him. No raising his arms, no dancing, no running around the field, never celebrating. And that made all of America ask, why does a man who touches glory as easily as breathing not even have a real smile? But the answer lay deep in his childhood wounds, moments when Barry was never praised, never made to believe his worth came from joy, not just effort. When people called him a legend, Barry only remembered the times he was left on the bench. When people cheered every run, Barry only heard his father's voice again, do better. Joy doesn't come from success when pain was there first. And so for Barry, a touchdown wasn't victory. It was just a moment he could breathe before stepping into the next cycle of pressure. Detroit expected him to redeem the team. Teammates looked to him as their only anchor. Coaches placed the future on his legs. The media scrutinized every run, as if it were the city's destiny. Fans saw him as the symbol of their last hope, but all of that just piled into an enormous pressure weighing heavily on the shoulders of a man who was used to enduring, but had never learned how to share. Barry never loved being in front of the cameras. He wasn't born to be a man of the spotlight, but in Detroit, the spotlight didn't just shine on him, it followed him, demanded, pushed, and gave him no right to rest. Many nights after games, when everyone else had gone home, Barry still sat alone in the training room, feet soaking in an ice bath, eyes blankly staring at the floor, as if talking to a sadness no one knew about. No teammate saw it, no reporter understood, no fan could imagine that the man who created moments of ultimate joy carried a sadness so deep it took his breath away. In the evenings, Barry returned to his small apartment, a place so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like impacts. He cooked a simple meal, rarely turned on the TV, sometimes just stood by the window watching Detroit's streetlights reflect on the glass. No laughter, no friends dropping by, no parties after wins, just the heartbreaking silence of a legend who never knew how to live like a normal person. Those lonely evenings became a habit that was frightening. Some days Barry sat in a cold bathtub for hours, the water long gone cold, but he still didn't want to get up. Not because he was tired, but because it was the only moment he felt he could turn off from expectations, from the cheers, from the pressure of carrying the whole team on his shoulders. The NFL called him the runner no one could touch. But in reality, Barry didn't want anyone to touch him either. No one getting too close, no one knowing what he really thought or felt. His life, whether in light or darkness, was endless runs with no stopping point, and the more he ran, the farther he felt pulled from the real joy of life. So that amid millions of eyes watching every game, Barry Sanders, one of the greatest players of all time, became the loneliest man on the field, a man who didn't fall to defenses, but was brought down by the emptiness inside him. And that loneliness grew, smoldered, clung to him like a shadow that never let go, just waiting for the moment to become the first crack leading to the biggest decision of his life, leaving the NFL when the whole world thought he was still too great to stop. The loneliness seeped like cold water into every corner of Barry's life, and by the late 1990s, it was no longer just a passing feeling, it had become a chronic illness draining every breath. The glories fans saw were dazzling lights, but to Barry they burned. Every touchdown scored without feeling anything, every night sitting alone in a dark apartment, every morning waking up with the question, how much more do I have to push today? All of it built into a pressure crushing his heart. And then in the summer of 1999, that pressure found its breaking point. For many weeks before sending the facts that shocked NFL history, Barry suffered endless insomnia. He woke up in the middle of the night, as if escaping a nightmare. But the nightmare wasn't in his sleep, it was real life. He paced his small apartment like a lost soul, streetlights filtering through the window onto the gaunt face of a man who could no longer find himself. He opened the fridge, then closed it, sat down, then stood up, picked up the TV remote, turned it over in his hand for a while, then set it down as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. He wondered why he no longer felt joy when running the ball, why every time he stepped on the field he only felt burden, why his heart had become so heavy. The few close people Barry shared with all described him the same way. He looked like a man who was alive, but whose soul was so tired it was about to go out. One of Barry's closest friends recalled that one late night, Barry sat in his car staring at the steering wheel like it was endless void, then said something that chilled anyone who heard it. "I don't feel alive anymore." That wasn't the words of someone depressed. It was the confession of a soul exhausted after too many years suffocating in silence. Barry's mindset in that period was exactly like what those who have fallen into deep despair experience: aching isolation, emptiness so complete he couldn't even feel his own body, and the sense of betraying himself by being unable to keep carrying what the whole world expected of him. The stadium lights that people saw as glory were now just the past. To Barry, they were like giant prison bars separating him from the real life he craved: peace, simplicity, not having to carry the expectations of millions on his shoulders. Yet he himself was afraid to admit it, afraid that even thinking about letting go was already betraying himself. He tried to keep going. He forced himself into the weight room, struggled to lift each dumbbell even as his hands shook. He showed up to team meetings, listened to strategies but couldn't focus. He went to practice, ran steps that his heart couldn't keep up with. But the harder he tried, the more his life felt like a fading shadow under the lights. Everything lost its color. Even the cheers, once sounding like music in his early career years, now were just empty noise hitting his mind like objects falling onto cold concrete. Then one night in late June, Barry sat alone at a small table. In front of him was a blank sheet of paper, beside it a pen, and nearby the fax machine that a few hours later would become the symbol of one of the most shocking decisions in NFL history. He put the pen down, then picked it up again. Every word he wrote felt like it drained part of his soul, not because he wasn't sure, but because he knew the moment the letter was sent, there would be no turning back. All the years of enduring, all the years of running in silence, all the years of carrying a city on his shoulders, it all poured into that evening like a storm inside him. He wrote, "I am retiring from professional football." Each letter, each stroke, trembling and painful. Barry wasn't running from Detroit. He wasn't betraying the fans. He wasn't quitting. He simply couldn't drag his exhausted soul any further. When the fax was sent, all of America exploded. The press called him a deserter. Analysts said he lacked fighting spirit. Angry fans burned 20 jerseys because they believed he had abandoned them. Detroit felt betrayed. The NFL felt insulted. The entire sports world was stunned that a star still at his absolute peak chose to leave without goodbye, without a press conference, without apology, without explanation. A fax, just one fax. And that was it. But no one saw the dark night before, the night Barry sat alone in silence, heart heavy as stone, eyes red from lack of sleep and pain. No one saw how many years he had fought loneliness, responsibility. No one helped carry fears he never voiced. No one saw the man worn away from the inside, who had pushed so hard he traded his very soul to keep hope alive for Detroit. No one knew he retired not because his legs were tired, but because his heart was too exhausted to stand any longer. Those who condemned him said Barry Sanders lacked passion, but the truth was the complete opposite, because he had loved the game so deeply, so truly, that exhaustion became irreparable. In his final career years he no longer felt like he was living in football, he was only existing in it. And existing is never enough to keep fighting. The retirement decision wasn't betrayal, it was the final cry for help from a soul that had endured too many unseen wounds, a cry no one heard, until it was too late, and that cold fax machine was just the tool for something far more painful, freedom born from despair. After the night he sent the fax, while all of America was still reeling from the shock, Barry Sanders entered a period he later admitted was the longest darkness of my life. No cheers, no encouragement, no noisy locker room, no racing heartbeat before kickoff. When the field went dark, part of his soul went dark too. Fans thought he was enjoying new freedom, living peacefully after the grueling NFL years. But the truth was the complete opposite. The early days after retirement for Barry were like falling into a bottomless abyss of aimlessness. His whole life, from the boy in Wichita running from family chaos to the star in Detroit, had been defined by one thing: running to survive, running to fight, running to feel alive. And now there was nowhere left to run. Mornings once filled with adrenaline were now just terrifying silence. He opened his eyes not knowing where to go today, what to do, who to be. Without the field, Barry lost the identity he had built over 3 decades. Those who had criticized him in the press didn't know that leaving the NFL for Barry was like dying once, that death wasn't in his body, it was in his soul. He couldn't say that publicly. He never even told his family. It was like how Simon Cowell was once overwhelmed after a scandal, stared at by the public, scrutinized by life, doubted by himself. But instead of reacting, Barry also chose silence. Silence to endure. Silence to hold it in. Silence to live through each day as if standing outside his own life. Barry's depression didn't erupt in outbursts of crying or anger. It flowed slowly, persistently, like a dark shadow following his every step. In the first weeks after leaving the NFL, he barely left the house. He didn't turn on the TV, because just seeing football made his heart ache. He didn't listen to the radio because he didn't want to hear commentators analyzing why he left. He avoided going out because he feared fans questioning, regretful, or angry looks. He even avoided his closest friends because he didn't know how to explain when he hadn't even explained it to himself. One day his close friend Tommy Vaughn drove to Barry's house, knocked for over 10 minutes, but no one answered. Finally, he looked through the window and saw Barry sitting on the sofa, motionless, eyes staring into nothingness, as if time had stopped. No music, no TV, no books, nothing at all, just the absolute silence of a soul, stripped of the one thing that had ever made it feel alive. Tommy didn't knock anymore. He quietly left, because in that moment, he understood Barry didn't need advice. Barry needed time, and the hope that one day he would find himself again. In the weeks that followed, Barry forced himself out of the house, to the supermarket, for walks, but the emptiness still clung to him like a fog that wouldn't lift. He realized he no longer had a reason to walk fast, to run, to feel purpose. For years he had carried an entire city, and now, nothing carried him. At night, Barry returned to familiar loneliness, but different from the loneliness during his playing days. If the Detroit Lions years made him feel trapped, now he felt useless. No one in the house needed him to score touchdowns. No one needed him to carry the team. No one followed his every run. The silence enveloping the apartment made it impossible for him to distinguish his inner voice from the void. He was used to the roar of 70,000 fans. Now the only sound he heard was his own breathing echoing in a cold bathtub. Barry still kept the habit of ice baths and soaking his feet, but no longer for physical recovery after games. This time the cold water was his way of making his body feel something, anything, just to know he still existed. For some people, an ice bath is a tool. For Barry, it was the last lifeline to feeling alive. Many nights he sat there for hours, darkness covering his skin, cold seeping into every muscle, and he tried to find a real sensation, but all he felt was the void expanding from his chest. Friends said Barry once told them something they'd never forget: "I was never afraid of my career ending, I just didn't know how to become a person after it ended." He knew he was luckier than many other players: no addictions, no bankruptcy, no media hounding, but that didn't make him feel better. That quiet depression didn't come from scandals, it came from the long silence that left him not knowing where he belonged. Barry had once been a star under millions of eyes, but when the lights went out, he was just a man trying to relearn how to live in a world not made for someone as silent as him. That emptiness lasted months, then years. He returned to Detroit Lions events, appearing in public with polite smiles, but those smiles never reached his eyes. Fans saw the legend. Barry saw painful fragments of an unfinished life, and like Simon Cowell after his scandal, though the circumstances and pain were different, both went through the most terrifying mental state, disorientation, yet still staying silent because they didn't want to burden anyone. Barry Sanders, the man who once terrified NFL defenses, was now fighting a more fearsome opponent than any: the emptiness of a life without the field. But he endured quietly, as he had his whole life: no cries for help, no complaints, no explanations, just living one day at a time, in a world he had to learn from scratch, a world with no running lanes to escape. That world was suffocatingly sad. But the emptiness didn't just follow Barry on his path away from the NFL, it seeped into his private life, shattering the one thing that had kept him standing after retirement: his family. Throughout the turbulent years of searching for his identity again, Barry tried to do the right thing he knew best: be a good husband and father. He rarely voiced his emotions, but he loved his family quietly, privately, with all the sincerity a man raised in silence could give. Yet in 2012, after years of trying, Barry's marriage also fell apart. No arguments, no scandal, no betrayal, just two people who once held hands, now looking at each other without understanding how the distance between them had grown so vast. To outsiders, the divorce was quiet: no disputes, no gossip, but inside Barry, it was one of the deepest wounds of his life, a cut that didn't bleed but hurt so much. It was hard to breathe. In his career, he had endured every criticism. In the NFL, he had handled every pressure. But losing his family, the thing he had always tried to protect as the last fortress of his heart, made him collapse in a way no one saw. Barry never spoke ill of his ex-wife, ever. He didn't write a memoir to vent, didn't use the media to tell his side. He quietly signed the papers, quietly left the courthouse, quietly returned to an empty house, silent, as always. But this time, silence didn't save him. It suffocated him. Those close to him said that during that time, Barry barely communicated with anyone. He appeared at a few public events, with faint smiles but eyes devoid of light. Once a friend asked if he was okay. Barry just replied, "I think I did everything I could, but sometimes things still leave." That was all he would say. No resentment, no blame, just the sad acceptance of someone accustomed to disappointment. For a man who had left the NFL feeling no longer alive, losing his family was a blow that knocked him down again. Because to Barry, family wasn't just a place to return to, it was the only anchor keeping him from drifting into darkness after retirement. And when that anchor slipped from his hands, Barry felt like a man swept out to sea at night, not screaming, not struggling, just letting the waves take him because he was too exhausted to fight. Weekend evenings that used to be for taking the kids to the park, to movies, to dinner, now became long nights in a terrifyingly quiet house. Barry sat alone on the sofa, dim yellow light shining on the old rug. On the table were photos of his children, carefree smiling faces whose precious moments he had missed too many of during his playing days. He picked up each photo as if holding something fragile, and some nights, his hands trembled, tears fell onto the pictures, and he quickly wiped them away as if afraid someone might see. Barry Sanders wasn't someone who cried often, his whole life was a series of holding it in. But the divorce was one of the rare times he allowed himself to be vulnerable, allowed that heavy heart to crack a little so the pain could escape. Close friends said many nights he called just to hear his kids' voices, not much talking, just asking if they'd eaten, how school was, if they were sick. Small ordinary questions, but full of the agony of a man who believed he had failed at the one role he never wanted to fail, being a father. That breakdown haunted Barry for years. Every weekend without the kids beside him, he felt a huge void in his chest, a sense of defeat no NFL loss had ever caused. On the field, failure could be fixed with effort. In marriage, once a heart falls, no training brings it back. At one point, Barry confessed to a close friend that he felt like a man passing through life without leaving any mark on the people he loves most. A statement that made listeners turn away to hide their tears, because it wasn't complaining. It was the sob of a soul that had endured too much loss, a soul always required to be strong, when in reality it had never been allowed to be weak. The most painful part was that Barry always saw himself as the one at fault, even when no one blamed him. He believed that if he had talked more, shared more, expressed emotions more, maybe things would have been different, but Barry didn't know how to open up. He was raised to be silent, to endure, to not be a burden, and that very silence, which had once been armor saving him on the field, became the knife stabbing into his marriage. When the kids went to their moms on weekends, Barry returned to an apartment that felt emptier than ever. He walked into their rooms, the small beds, half-finished toys, drawings they made for him, and felt like looking at his life split in two. He sat on the edge of the bed, placed his hand on his son's blanket where the warmth was gone, then bowed his head and cried. Those rare tears, held back for decades, now poured like a flood down the face of the man who had made millions believe he never knew pain. The divorce didn't make Barry lose his family, but it made him lose the feeling that he was holding it together. And that wound, deep, quiet, unseen, became one of the greatest pains of his life. A cut that didn't bleed, but kept seeping endlessly. In the chaos of the post-divorce years, when loneliness lingered in every corner, and the sense of failure cut deep into his heart, only one thing pulled Barry out of bed each morning: his children. If his NFL career had cost him priceless time with them, now he tried to make up for everything, even knowing lost time couldn't be reclaimed. Barry didn't say it in words, but in every small action, every quiet choice, it was clear he was trying to atone for the years spent running after responsibility, pressure, and glory, only to miss the moments that should have belonged to his family. He spent more time with Barry Jr., talking to his son more, listening more. But even with the complete love he gave, Barry still didn't want to intrude too strongly into his child's life. When Barry Jr. started playing basketball and football, his father always tried to show up. But Barry Sanders, the legend, the icon, the man who once made the entire NFL bow, didn't choose to sit in the front row or appear with the aura of a superstar. He stood quietly at the back of the field, hands in his jacket pockets, baseball cap pulled low, blending into the crowd like an ordinary dad. Not because he was afraid of being recognized, but because he was afraid his very presence would put pressure on his son. Barry Jr. had his own talent, his own path, and Barry understood that a shadow too large can sometimes be a burden rather than a blessing. So he watched quietly from afar, eyes never leaving the ball, heart pounding with every step his son took. In some games, he saw Barry Jr. make mistakes and wanted to run right down to the field to hug him and say everything was okay. But he stayed still, his hands clenched in his pockets. He let his son get up on his own, because he knew the boy needed that, and because he knew the feeling of getting back up alone was more important than any advice. But when the game ended, if his son looked toward the stands and saw him, Barry would give a small smile, the kind of smile he rarely gave the whole world, but one that was always genuine, when given to his own child. On evenings without games, the two of them sat watching TV, went out to dinner, or simply played ball in the yard. Barry no longer tried to be a hero, he just wanted to be a dad, the kind of dad he had longed for as a child. And in that journey, Barry Jr. gradually became Barry's emotional anchor, something similar to how Eric had saved Simon Cowell from the abyss of fame and scandal. For Barry, his son wasn't just family, he was the reason to keep going, to keep healing the wounds left by the NFL, divorce and depression. Once on a quiet evening, Barry Jr. joked, "Dad, do you know you're still the best running back in Madden?" Barry burst out laughing, a rare laugh that only those truly close to him ever heard. In that moment, the pain didn't disappear, but it softened, eased as if someone had gently stroked it, because in his son's laughter, he felt he still had value, not the value of an NFL legend, but of a man truly loved. Barry also taught his son what he had learned himself through childhood and career: humility. He told him that wins don't define a person's worth, that love and kindness matter more than titles. Every lesson he passed on was a gentler version of the lessons life had once carved into him with pain, and in that quiet way, Barry Jr. became the new anchor keeping Barry steady through the storms. He pulled him out of dark days, pulled him to school games, helped him find joy in small things: a beautiful throw, a family dinner, a silent but peaceful car ride. Barry Sanders, the man who had left the NFL in despair and endured depression in silence, finally found something the field had never given him: a sense of belonging. Looking back on his life, Barry understood he had never truly been strong, he only knew how to endure. But his son taught him the opposite, that love isn't something to endure, but something that can heal. And because of that, amid the deep cracks of his life, Barry found a rare chapter filled with light, the chapter of father and son, of redemption, of hope. It wasn't dramatic salvation, no explosive moment, no grand soundtrack, just two people sitting side by side, one old, one young, sharing the silence. But sometimes, that very silence is what saves a soul that has weathered too many storms. In the following years, as Barry gradually found some peace from fatherhood, he also withdrew from the world that had once captivated millions. No press conferences, no talk shows, no advising any team. Barry almost vanished from the public eye, as if he had never been the center of the NFL. Fans said Barry had faded into the shadows, but to Barry, it wasn't shadows, it was the only place he felt safe. After years thrown into the media storm, burdened with the responsibility of an entire city like Detroit, stretched between expectations and pain, Barry chose an extremely minimalist life: a small house, an ordinary car, no fixed schedule, no parties, no glamour, no noise. He gradually became the complete opposite of his glory years, a man living quietly like a river, no longer wanting to break its banks. Few friends, rare phone calls, meetings that grew fewer over the years. Not because Barry hated connection, but because he no longer knew how to open up after so many years living in silence. Many described Barry as a shadow drifting between two worlds, no longer belonging to the NFL, but not yet truly belonging to ordinary life. He smiled at people, nodded to those who recognized him, But loneliness still lingered in his eyes, the loneliness that had followed him from Wichita to Detroit, from the NFL peak to the post-retirement years. The biggest question for Barry now wasn't how he lived, but what he was living to find. Some said Barry was running from his past, that he didn't want to remember the Detroit Lions, didn't want to face the lights, didn't want to hear again the cheers that had lifted him to the top, and then left him in darkness when he fell. But others believed Barry wasn't running, he was just searching for what the NFL had taken, his true self. For many years, Barry had been asked too much to be hope, to be a symbol, to be the emotional support for millions, but he had never had the chance to just be himself. And when he stepped away from the NFL, from the broken marriage, from rooms full of pressure, he realized he didn't know who Barry Sanders the real person was, not the athlete, not the icon, not the legend, just a man wanting peace. So the silence wasn't escape, it was the journey back home. In those years, Barry began to love the small things he had never had time to notice before: a morning without an alarm, a quiet coffee shop, a walk where no one recognized him, an afternoon movie with his son, ordinary things that to him were more precious than any MVP award. Occasionally he accepted invitations to charity events, or a small interview, but each appearance made him seem more like a figure from legend, rarely seen, few words, but every word making people fall silent. The media started calling him the most mysterious legend in NFL history, not because he had secrets, but because he had never truly belonged to the spotlight others placed on him. He simply wanted to live the life he had never been able to live before. At one point, a major newspaper tried to do an in-depth piece on his post-NFL life. They contacted him through many channels, tried every approach, but Barry just replied lightly, "Thanks, but I don't have much to say about myself." He didn't want to retell the tragedies, nor did he want to share the good things. He saw his life story as something to keep private, both to cherish and to avoid reliving old wounds. And then there were days when Barry just drove without direction. No music, no calls, just driving on the long roads of Michigan, window down, letting cold wind rush in, as if that emptiness needed the wind to carry it away. In those moments, no one knew what he was thinking. He just looked straight ahead, unclear if he was searching for the way forward or running from something behind. But one thing was clear: Barry was no longer the man suffocated by pressure. Though he still carried the wounds, though sadness still hovered like a long shadow, the silence had for the first time let him feel freedom. Not the freedom of a hero, but the freedom of someone who had lost everything and was now vaguely piecing himself back together. The media could call him the most mysterious legend in NFL history, but to those who understood Barry Sanders' endurance, they knew that mystery wasn't a wall, it was the last protection for a heart that had suffered too much damage. In that silence, Barry hadn't disappeared. He was learning to live again, slowly, cautiously, but more authentically than ever. In those years of quiet living, when Barry thought his life had finally entered its most peaceful phase, fate once again pulled him back into the storm. On what seemed like an ordinary morning in 2024, Barry was traveling with one of his sons, a short trip, unplanned, just father and son, wanting to spend some time together. That morning, Barry felt discomfort in his stomach area, a burning sensation like the stomach pains he had experienced a few times before. He didn't pay much attention. He had overcome hundreds of tackles from guys twice his size. A stomachache was nothing to fear. Barry even joked, probably just ate too much last night. But then just minutes later, something in his body changed. The pain spread from his stomach to his chest, like an invisible hand squeezing his heart. He tried to breathe deeply, but the air seemed stuck in his throat. The whole world spun, and then Barry staggered, grabbed the arm of a chair, eyes wide in horror before his knees buckled. His son screamed. The whole room descended into chaos. Barry tried to say something, but his lips stiffened, unable to form words. He felt his chest being crushed. The pain spread to his left arm, the kind of sign people only hear about in movies, or read in books. But now, it was tearing him apart. No, this can't be. He tried to think, but every thought was swallowed by the most primal human panic, the fear of death. In that moment, Barry understood he wasn't just enduring pain, he was facing death. Panic flooded his chest. He looked at his son, the boy's eyes wet and terrified. And the first thing that came to Barry's mind wasn't his career, wasn't the records, wasn't the lights of Detroit, but the words he had never had the courage to say fully. "I'm proud of you kids." He had never said it the way he wanted, and now, he feared he would never get the chance. The heart attack hit as fast as the most dangerous tackle of his life, but far more ruthless. By the time medical staff arrived, Barry could barely speak. They lifted him onto the stretcher, hooked up monitors, applied oxygen, everything happening amid shouts, running footsteps, people calling to each other in panic. His son ran alongside the stretcher, gripping the cold metal edge tightly, crying and calling, "Dad, don't leave me." Barry heard it, but as if through thick water, everything grew distant. His heart beat irregularly, cold sweat poured out, his ears rang, and for the first time since childhood running alone in the dark alleys of Wichita, Barry truly felt small, weak and utterly helpless. As the emergency room doors closed in front of his son, Barry felt the whole world shrink to a single point, the fear that he would never walk out again. Inside the ER, cold white lights shone down on his pale face. The monitor beeped steadily, each sound like a cruel countdown to life. The sharp smell of antiseptic, doctors' shoes squeaking on the shiny floor, and in the middle of all that medical chaos, Barry Sanders, the man who once made massive defenses hesitate, lay there like an ordinary man facing the line between life and death. He tremblingly grabbed the doctor's hand, eyes wide with a panic he had never let anyone see. Am I going to make it?" That question wasn't just about survival, it was the question of a life that had endured too much pain, yet kept getting up. It was the question of a father who hadn't loved his children enough yet. It was the question of a soul that had run forever to escape darkness, now lying motionless and unsure if it could run one more time. The doctor didn't answer right away. No one does in moments like that. They just said, "We're doing everything we can." But Barry knew the truth. His heart had taken enough. Years of loneliness, years of silent endurance, years of mental exhaustion, all of it had piled onto a body no longer young, and now the price was being paid with the horrifying pain crushing his chest. In the haze, Barry heard his son crying in the hallway. He heard someone reading vital signs, heard machines adjusting, heard his heart beating unevenly, as if about to stop. And then, in those seemingly endless minutes, he saw moments of his life flash by like an old film reel. The nights running from chaos in Wichita, the practices under dim lights in high school, the glorious 1988 season at Oklahoma State, the frantic games with Detroit, the fateful 1999 fax, the broken marriage, the lonely evenings in a dark apartment, and the gentle moments with his children. His whole life had been running. But this time he couldn't run. He could only wait for his heart to decide if it wanted to keep going. That heart attack didn't just shatter Barry's body, it stripped away the last remnants of the legendary shell, exposing a truth he had never faced. He wasn't immortal, not superhuman, not a steel icon. He was just a human, a man full of cracks, full of wounds, full of regrets, and full of unspoken love. When Barry woke up after the critical moment, the lights were still white, the monitor still beeping steadily, but the world was different. His son hugged his hand tightly, buried his head in his shoulder, and sobbed, and Barry, the man who rarely cried, let his own tears fall. In that moment he decided, if this heart beats one more day, it won't beat in silence anymore. The heart attack didn't just nearly take Barry's life, it changed his entire life. The way he saw himself, the way he loved his children, the way he existed in a world that had suffocated him for years. That was the moment Barry Sanders stopped running to escape the darkness, and ran for the first time toward the light. The 2024 heart attack didn't just nearly take Barry Sanders' life, it took away the old version of him. When he left the hospital, his heart still weak, breath still short, hands still trembling slightly when signing papers, Barry understood he had crossed an invisible door, the door where people leave the past behind to keep living. No more days sprinting across the field, no more ghostly silence after retirement, but also no more self-destruction in silence. Now every morning Barry opened his eyes, he felt something he had never fully felt before. He was truly alive. He changed his lifestyle not because doctors ordered it, but because his heart had taught him the harshest lesson. He ate more carefully, less fried food, less red meat, more vegetables, more fruit, drinking water on schedule. Those small things he had always dismissed now became rituals of gratitude. Barry practiced breathing, meditation, feeling each heartbeat in his chest like a fragile miracle he didn't want to lose again. Every morning he walked slowly around his neighborhood, not running, not pushing his heart hard, just light steps as if listening to the whisper of life under his feet. Some mornings Barry lingered longer in the small yard near his home. Sunlight shone on his face, warm and gentle. He closed his eyes and smiled. A real smile, rare, unforced, because returning from the brink of death, he realized that breathing was a gift. Not everyone gets a second chance. Yet even as life softened, fear still clung to Barry like the long shadow of an unforgettable memory. Sometimes just a mild chest pain made him stop, panic, and place his hand on his heart to check if it was still beating steadily. Sometimes just an unusual fatigue sent his mind back to the moment lying on the hotel floor, with ragged breaths and his son's terrified eyes. The betrayal of his heart, the thing he once thought strongest, had left an invisible wound that never stopped hurting. Barry didn't hide that fear, but he didn't let it consume him either. He lived slower, softer, with the understanding that sometimes even his own body needed forgiveness, love, care, like a forgotten child, like he himself had been in his Wichita childhood. And in that recovery process, Barry began doing something he hadn't done in decades, making peace with the past. He thought about his father, the stern man who could never say gentle words. Barry no longer blamed him. He understood his father was also a victim of his era, of poverty, of the emotional suppression that generation had to bear, and he realized his father loved him, just in a harsh way that hurt. That forgiveness freed a deep part of Barry. Then he thought about the NFL, about the Detroit Lions, about the years worn down by responsibility, loneliness, and pressure. Before remembering it made his heart tighten, now it didn't. He no longer viewed his career with sadness. He saw it as a chapter of life that was over, beautiful, painful, but necessary. A chapter he had lived fully with every breath. He thought about the broken marriage, about the quiet mistakes, the distances he didn't know how to bridge, the nights looking at photos of his kids without daring to cry out loud. And for the first time Barry stopped blaming himself. He understood every path has limits, and sometimes leaving is a form of love. What mattered was he still had the chance to be a better, gentler, more authentic father. Barry also thought about his retirement decision, the one that angered all of America, but saved his soul. Returning from the gates of death, he no longer doubted that choice. He knew he had done what was necessary to survive, and that survival was the answer to every criticism. When his heart nearly stopped, Barry realized his life had never been just about football. It was the journey of a forgotten boy from Wichita, a man who lived humbly amid glory, a father learning to love with a once shattered heart, and a human trying to keep going, while knowing every day is a fragile gift. The heart attack didn't make Barry fear life. It made him cherish it more. No longer running to escape the darkness, no longer enduring in silence like an old habit, no longer thinking he had to be strong all the time. Barry now lives like a man who once died and was reborn, a man who understands that glory isn't everything, that pain isn't the end, and that a heart, even one that once betrayed him, can still beat again, with all the gratitude he never knew he had. Since stepping back from the gates of death, Barry no longer views his life through the eyes of an athlete who once carried the weight of an entire city on his shoulders. He views it through the eyes of someone who truly understands the value of existence. And that very change has made people realize something the NFL perhaps took a long time to learn. Barry Sanders' legacy was never in the numbers, not in the 15,269 rushing yards, not in the legendary cuts, not in the games where defenses collapsed with every juke. Barry's true legacy lies in the way he lived. In a sports world, where noise often drowns out character, where ego sometimes outweighs the team, Barry Sanders became a rare model of humility that bordered on unreal. He never beat his chest after a long run, never called himself great, never looked down on others. To him, football wasn't a stage for self-assertion, it was a place to give, and when he had given everything, he quietly walked away. Kids in Detroit growing up in poverty, instability, and streets full of violence don't talk about Barry Sanders in terms of yards or MVPs. They talk about the kind man who stayed with us when Detroit had nothing to be proud of. In a city once mocked, once seen as a symbol of economic decline, Barry appeared as a light people could hold on to, not the blinding light of victories, but the warm light of humility and hope. Many parents in Detroit still tell their children the story of the small man who carried the whole city on his legs, but never demanded anyone cheer for him. If you want to know what greatness is, they say, look at Barry Sanders. In schools, drawings of Barry still hang on walls. In youth practice fields, coaches still repeat his words, "Let your talent speak for you." And in the hearts of millions of fans, Barry isn't a player, he's a symbol of kindness in sports, one that generations to come still see as a shining example. The NFL has produced many legends, but very few walk away from the spotlight with their soul still intact. Barry did that, because to him a person's worth isn't in the applause they receive, but in how they stand when no one is watching. That legacy shows clearest in how he faced pain. He endured poverty, endured isolation, endured crushing pressure from a team that wasn't strong enough, endured criticism when he retired, endured emotional wounds from a broken marriage, endured a near-fatal blow from his own heart. But through all those trials, Barry never let anger cloud his character. He never blamed others, never attacked anyone, never used tragedy to bargain for the world's sympathy. He chose silence, chose kindness, chose to get up quietly, and that very silence echoes farther than any cheer that ever called his name in a stadium. People realized that man didn't need to speak loudly to inspire, didn't need to boast to prove his worth, didn't need to stand on the highest podium to be great. Barry's greatness comes from how he makes others want to be better versions of themselves. A boy in Detroit once said in a TV interview, "Barry isn't a hero because he ran fast. He's a hero because he never let anyone down." That simple statement captures the true essence of Barry's legacy. He doesn't make people admire him with noise. He earns their respect by existing as a kind person, even when life wasn't kind to him. In his later years, looking back on that long road full of loss and glory, Barry never says he did anything extraordinary. He just says, "I tried to live true to what I believe." But the world knows better than he does. Barry Sanders left a mark on the NFL that can't be measured in numbers. He left a way of living, a reminder that character never goes out of style, that humility can be stronger than any victory, that true greatness isn't in the yards, but in the heart of the runner. And when people tell his story to future generations, it doesn't start with how many yards did Barry run. It starts with how did Barry Sanders face life. And the answer always leaves listeners silent, because it's the story of an imperfect mortal man who was great in the simplest way, through kindness. And then looking back at the entire journey, people see clearly that Barry Sanders' life wasn't the story of a great athlete. It was the beautiful tragedy of a resilient soul tested by fate from birth to middle age. A forgotten boy from Wichita, a teenager dismissed, a college student who became a legend because desperation turned into strength, an NFL player lonely in the dazzling lights, a man who sent a fax to retire because his heart was exhausted, a father standing quietly in the back rows so as not to pressure his son, a soul that withdrew, living silently for years to heal wounds no one saw, and finally, a middle-aged man lying on the edge of life and death, fearing only that he hadn't told his children how proud he was of them. Barry Sanders endured too much poverty, being underrated, pressure, loneliness, divorce, depression, a heart attack that nearly took his life. But through all those tragedies, he was never defeated. He didn't rage at the world, didn't struggle against fate, didn't scream about his pain. He just quietly got up, quietly kept going, quietly lived with the dignity he valued more than any title. That is the beautiful sadness of Barry Sanders, a sadness not pitiful but deep as the bottom of a human well. Throughout the journey he defeated darkness many times, the darkness of a forgotten childhood, the darkness of crushing expectations, the darkness of loneliness amid the lights, the darkness of silent years after retirement, and finally, the darkness of death waiting at the edge of his heart. But even in victory, darkness touched him, leaving cracks in his life that never disappear. It made him more humble, more introspective, more compassionate, and it made him the most authentic symbol of quiet resilience. That is also the lesson America needs. In an era where people confuse noise with strength, boasting with victory, spotlight with true value, Barry isn't a hero in the Hollywood mold. He doesn't stand up to give speeches, doesn't say catchy slogans, doesn't wear the bright red cape of superhero icons. But he taught America something no MVP ever could. True greatness lies in how a person endures in silence, stands firm when no one is watching, lives kindly even when life isn't kind to them. Barry never won a Super Bowl. He never had moments lifting a trophy with confetti raining down. But his greatness goes beyond any title, because titles only record achievements. Barry recorded the essence of being human: humility, resilience, kindness, and strength born from pains too deep to put into words. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about Barry is the paradox he left behind. He was the man who ran fastest on the field, but lived slowest off it. He was a legend under the brightest lights, but chose to live where fewest people could see. He was the player who brought defenses to their knees, but the man who always bowed his head humbly before every victory in life. Time took his speed, took his youth, took the muscle strength that once amazed the world, took the endurance of his heart, nearly taking his life. But there is one thing time could never touch: Barry Sanders' dignity. A dignity not from yards, from awards, or from highlight reels, but from the way he walked through darkness, one step at a time, never demanding the light shine on him. And so when America speaks of Barry Sanders, they speak in a slow, low voice, as if telling a classic legend about the man who carried the burden of an entire city on his shoulders, yet kept his own soul pure and silent in a rare way. The man who turned tragedy into strength. The man who lived humbly in victory and proudly in pain. In his later years, standing in front of the mirror with gray hair and a body no longer as strong as before, Barry understood that he could no longer run like he used to, but he also understood that he no longer needed to, because life, after everything, had proven one simple yet profound truth: time can take away strength, but it cannot take away the dignity of a legend. The journey of Barry Sanders, from the forgotten boy in Wichita, to the lonely NFL legend under millions of lights, to the man who nearly lost his life in the 2024 heart attack, is a story that leaves anyone silent with sorrow and admiration. We feel pain remembering the image of the teenager on the bench, his talent buried just because he was too small, running quietly in dark fields to escape family chaos. Our hearts tighten thinking of how he exploded at Oklahoma State, yet still carried the fear, "I don't deserve this," or how he was trapped with the Detroit Lions, the weakest team in the NFL, even though his legs created miracles that amazed the entire nation. And that pain becomes suffocating when imagining the moment he signed the retirement fax, a legend exhausted, desperate, admitting to himself, "I don't feel alive anymore," not because he was weak, but because he had endured too long in silence. The tragedy of a broken marriage, the nights he cried over photos of his children, and the heart attack that made him tremble as he asked the doctor, "Am I going to make it?" All are slices revealing one truth: sometimes the strongest people are the ones with the most vulnerable hearts. But from those very wounds, Barry left America a profound lesson. True greatness lies not in records, but in dignity and quiet resilience. He never boasted, never raged at fate, never lost his kindness, even when life took his childhood, his career, his marriage, and nearly his life. Americans can look at that journey and understand, in a noisy society, sometimes the greatest strength is the ability to stand firm in silence, and in a world that worships success, the most valuable thing is the character we hold on to until the very end. Barry Sanders, not just a football legend, but a beautiful testament to the human heart facing life's storms. The journey of Barry Sanders, from the forgotten boy in Wichita to the lonely NFL legend under millions of lights, to the man who nearly lost his life in the 2024 heart attack, is a story that leaves anyone silent with sorrow and admiration. We feel pain remembering the image of the teenager on the bench, his talent buried just because he was too small, running quietly in dark fields to escape family chaos. Our hearts tighten thinking of how he exploded at Oklahoma State, yet still carried the fear, "I don't deserve this," or how he was trapped with the Detroit Lions, the weakest team in the NFL, even though his legs created miracles that amazed the entire nation. And that pain becomes suffocating when imagining the moment he signed the retirement fax, a legend exhausted, desperate, admitting to himself, "I don't feel alive anymore." Not because he was weak, but because he had endured too long in silence. The tragedy of a broken marriage, the nights he cried over photos of his children, and the heart attack that made him tremble as he asked the doctor, "Am I going to make it?" All are slices revealing one truth. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones with the most vulnerable hearts, but from those very wounds, Barry left America a profound lesson. True greatness lies not in records, but in dignity and quiet resilience. He never boasted, never raged at fate, never lost his kindness, even when life took his childhood, his career, his marriage, and nearly his life. Americans can look at that journey and understand in a noisy society, sometimes the greatest strength is the ability to stand firm in silence, and in a world that worships success, the most valuable thing is the character we hold onto until the very end.
Oh!
Because teen wonders, even telementus, but in Dolly Sander Bemive, Barry Sanders, not just a football legend, but a beautiful testament to the human heart facing life's storms.